The dress did not fit. That was the first thing that happened on the morning everything else started. Marin Solis stood on a low wooden platform in a bridal shop in Durango, Colorado, wearing a gown that had been altered twice and was still pulling across her shoulders in a way that made the seamstress press her lips together and say nothing. The room smelled like lavender and old carpet. The fluorescent light above the three-way mirror did what fluorescent lights in fitting rooms have always done, which is make every woman look like she is being processed for something. "We can let it out another inch," the seamstress said, not meeting Marin's eyes in the mirror. Marin looked at herself, all of herself, because there was nowhere else to look. 31 years old, dark hair pinned up in a way she never wore it. A little too much of everything, according to every person who had ever looked at her the way the seamstress was looking at her right now. "Another inch is fine," Marin said. From the velvet chair in the corner, her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Caroline Whitfield, tilted her wineglass very slightly. She had brought wine to a 10 o'clock fitting. She was that kind of woman. She was thin in the way that takes daily effort, and she wore it like an accomplishment, which perhaps it was. "The cut is lovely," Caroline said. "On the right figure, it would be stunning." She did not look at Marin when she said it. She looked at her wine. Marin felt the words go in, the way those kinds of words always go in, which is quietly and deep. She had been receiving that variety of comment for so long that she had developed a system for handling them. The system was, make a joke, keep smiling, leave the room before your face does something you cannot explain away. She had refined this system across 14 years. Across every classroom and family dinner and public swimming pool and doctor's office waiting room, where a stranger had felt entitled to comment on how much space she took up. "Right figure," Marin said pleasantly. "Is that a size or a shape? I can never keep track." The seamstress made a small sound. Caroline smiled without moving her eyes. Marin smiled back. Inside, something that had been sitting quietly in her chest for a very long time, Zotrer, pressed a little harder against her ribs. She drove home alone. Daniel, her fiancé, had offered to come to the fitting and she had told him not to, which she now understood had been a small mercy she had given herself without knowing it. And she did not want him to see the room, the chair, the wine, the mirror. She did not want to watch him not know what to say. She stopped at the grocery store on the way home. She did not plan to. She pulled into the parking lot the way you pull over for something you only half notice. And she walked in, and she went to the baking aisle, and she stood in front of the flour. There was bread flour, and all-purpose, and whole wheat, and something labeled high protein that she had never thought about before. She picked up the bread flour, 5 pounds in a plain white bag. It was heavier than she expected, which is how 5 pounds always feels when you are not expecting to pick it up. She stood there for longer than was reasonable. The aisle was empty. The store's music was playing something from the early 90s that she almost recognized. She put the flour in the cart. Then she went back and got 3 more bags, because something in her had decided something, and when that happened, the best thing to do was not to argue with it. That evening, after Daniel came home and ate the dinner she had made, and asked about the fitting with the careful cheerfulness of a man who had already read the situation, she told him about the bakery idea. She did not frame it as an idea. That was important. She said it the way you say a fact. "After the wedding," she said, "I want to open a bakery." He was quiet for 1 second, which was all she needed to hear to know he was taking it seriously. "What kind?" he said. "Bread," she said. "Real bread. The kind that takes days to make. Heritage grains, wild fermentation, the whole thing." He nodded. He did not ask if she knew how. He did not say it sounded hard, or expensive, or risky, which it was all 3 of those things. He said, "Okay, let's figure out how." She loved him an embarrassing amount in that moment, and she looked down at her plate so he would not see it fully. They told Caroline at Sunday dinner 3 days later. Caroline was there because she was always there, and she brought a dish she described as a salad, but which was mostly cheese, and she sat at the head of Daniel's table, the way she had always sat at the head of Daniel's table, even after it became Marin and Daniel's table. Marin said it clearly, without preamble. A bakery, sourdough, heritage grains, after the wedding. Caroline listened with her head tilted slightly, the way a person listens when they are already forming their response, and the listening is just politeness with a timer on it. A bakery, Caroline said. How ambitious. She said it softly. She even smiled when she said it. But the word ambitious, in Caroline's mouth, in that tone, with that smile, did not mean ambitious. It meant the other thing. It meant, do you really think so? It meant, is that wise for you specifically? It meant, I am not going to say what I am thinking, but you should know I am thinking it. Maren looked at her across the table and kept her face very steady. Yes, she said. Ambitious is a good word for it. Daniel touched her hand under the table. Caroline looked at her wine. That night, after everything was cleaned up and Caroline had left and Daniel had fallen asleep, Maren went to the kitchen. It was almost midnight. She opened one of the bags of bread flour and poured some into a bowl and added water and salt and a little bit of starter she had begun keeping in a jar in the back of the refrigerator 2 weeks ago, just to see if she could keep it alive. She mixed it with her hands. Flour went up her forearms. It dusted the counter and got in the creases of her knuckles, and she did not bother to shake it off. She did not know yet how to make great bread. She knew that. She had no training, no professional instruction, no mentor, and no real certainty that this would become anything beyond a very expensive hobby that ended in several dense loaves and a kitchen that smelled like a mistake. She shaped the dough into a rough ball and covered it, and left it on the counter. Then she washed her hands, turned off the light, and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept better than she had in a while, which was something. In the morning the dough had risen. Not perfectly, not the way it would later, but it had grown, which meant it was alive, which meant she had not killed it yet, which meant tomorrow she would try again. She went to work, which at that time was a desk job at a regional insurance office, and she sat through 7 hours of it, thinking about fermentation times and hydration ratios and the particular quality of light in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, which she had noticed was different from every other light. She came home and started the second batch. She did not know it yet, but this was the beginning. Not the bakery, not the recognition that came later, not the features in the food magazines or the line out the door, or any of the things that people would eventually write about. This, right here, a woman in her kitchen at midnight with flour on her arms, making something because something inside her had decided to, and deciding not to need anyone's permission to find out if she could. Caroline's voice was still in her head. The seamstress's pressed lips. 14 years of rooms where she had been too much of something. The dough sat on the counter. She covered it carefully and turned off the light. The first loaf was a failure. So was the second. The third was edible if you were hungry enough, and you buttered it heavily, and you did not think too hard about what bread was supposed to be. The fourth was dense in the middle, in a way that suggested the fermentation had not gone far enough. The fifth cracked wrong along the score, and came out looking like something that had given up halfway through. Maren ate them all, every single loaf, failure by failure, because she was not going to waste food, and she was not going to pretend the failures had not happened. She ate them with soup, with eggs, plain with butter at 7 in the morning, before driving to the insurance office. She made notes on a legal pad. Too wet, not long enough in the cold, the score too shallow, the steam not right. Daniel ate every loaf with her and said they were good. She knew they were not good. She also knew what he was doing, and she loved him for it. She read everything she could find, library books on fermentation science, bread forums online where men with long beards argued passionately about hydration percentages with a level of feeling that Maren found both ridiculous and completely understandable. A dense scientific paper on wild yeast behavior that she read 3 times before it began to make sense, and then read again because she wanted it to make more than sense. She wanted it to become second nature. The starter in the back of the fridge became 2 jars, then 3. She named them. She fed them on a schedule she kept on a sticky note on the refrigerator door. When she was out of town for a work conference for 3 days, she asked Daniel to feed them, and left him written instructions with the patience and specificity of a person entrusting a living thing to someone who did not fully understand what it was. He fed them correctly. She was grateful in a way that was slightly out of proportion to the task. The kitchen changed. It had always been a functional room, the kind of kitchen that cooked meals without having any particular opinion about it, but now it became something else. The counter nearest the window was permanently dusted with flour. The cracked Dutch oven that had belonged to her grandmother sat on the stove every morning, heating slowly while the dough made its final preparation for going in. The legal pad of notes grew into a binder, tabbed and organized by variable: hydration, fermentation time, oven temperature, flour type. She ordered red Fife wheat flour from a farm in Montana, then something called Sonoran White, a heritage grain that tasted of sun and early wheat, grown in the Southwest for hundreds of years before industrial agriculture looked at it and decided efficiency was more interesting than flavor. She began to understand what bread wanted. Not what she wanted from it, but what it wanted from her. It wanted patience more than technique. It wanted attention more than cleverness. It wanted her to be in the kitchen at 4 in the morning when the timing was right, not when it was convenient. And it did not negotiate on this point. She stopped negotiating. The Saturday she set up a table at the Durango Farmers Market, she brought 12 loaves. She had spent $40 on a small folding sign with the name Solis written on it in plain letters, and she had lined the loaves on a wooden board she had sanded and oiled herself, and she stood behind the table in her best apron and she waited. 3 loaves sold. The other 9 came home with her. A woman at the next table, who sold lavender sachets and decorative wreaths, and who had the kind of branding that suggested she had taken a social media course specifically for cottage business owners, looked at Marin's table with a precise and unreadable expression. She did not say anything. The expression did enough. Marin loaded the unsold loaves into her car, with the careful movements of someone who has decided not to feel this particular thing today, and will revisit the decision later. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Week 4 she sold 7 loaves. Week 6 she sold 10. Week 8 she sold out before noon and turned away 4 customers, and she sat in her car afterward with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the steering wheel, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, the particular kind of joy that no one can take from you, because you built it yourself out of early mornings and patience, and all those failures you ate alone. Then she drove home and started the next batch. The thing about making bread this way, the slow way, the real way, was that it was never finished. There was no moment when you arrived. There was only the next loaf, which was either going to teach you something or confirm what you had already learned, and either way it required your full attention, and your willingness to be wrong, and your refusal to cut the process short because you were tired. Marin was almost always tired. She was getting up at 3:30 or 4 on market days to have bread ready by 8. She was doing this around the insurance job, which she had not yet quit because she was not certain enough to quit it, and around the ordinary requirements of being a married person in a house that needed cleaning and a life that needed tending. Daniel helped where he could. He learned to stay out of the kitchen during the critical hours, and to handle dinner on the nights she was working through a proofing problem and couldn't stop. He learned to read when she needed to talk about bread, and when she needed to be quiet next to someone who wasn't going to ask when the bakery was going to open, as though the question was just curiosity. Caroline asked the question every time she came over. She asked it in the same tone she used for everything involving Marin's plans, which was the tone of someone managing their expectations on behalf of another person. Marin stopped telling her things in detail. The Dutch oven cracked in October of that first year, a hairline fracture along the base that she found one morning when she lifted it to preheat. She stood holding it and looking at the crack, and then she put it back on the stove anyway, because she had checked and the crack was in a place that would hold, and because this Dutch oven had been her grandmother's, and her grandmother had been a woman who did not replace things just because they were imperfect. Her grandmother had been complicated. She had not been warm. She had been a woman of specific rules and high standards, and very little softness, and she had died when Marin was 22, and left her exactly 2 things: a small amount of money that Marin had used practically, and the cast-iron Dutch oven, which Marin had used practically in a different way. Marin kept the cracked Dutch oven. She used it every day. The crack never spread. Week 11 was the week everything changed. She knew it immediately, the way you know when something has crossed a threshold, before you have words for what the threshold was. The loaf that came out of the oven that morning was different. The crust had blistered correctly, golden and dark in the right places, and when she pulled it out and held it in her hands, and knocked the bottom of it with her knuckle, it rang. Not a dull thump, a ring, hollow and true, the sound that bakers have listened for across centuries, because it is the sound of a loaf that has made itself fully. She stood in the kitchen at 5:15 in the morning, holding the loaf against her chest. She was in her flour-dusted apron, her hair pulled back, the kitchen around her warm from the oven, and she held that loaf the way you hold a thing that has cost you something to make. Daniel came in. He had heard her get up, as he always did, and had gone back to sleep, and then had come down because something about the quality of the silence told him it was different. He looked at her holding the loaf. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The loaf was still warm against her chest. Outside, the sky over the mountains was going from black to blue to something that wasn't quite either, and the kitchen light was the only light, and in it, she looked like a person who had just understood something that had always been true about her, but that she had not been able to see until right now. She had spent her whole life being told, in ways large and small, and loud and quiet, that she was too much, too wide, too hopeful about things that were not realistic for someone like her, too slow to understand that her place was a smaller place, a quieter place, a place that did not require people to look directly at her. She had believed it, the way you believe things that are repeated often enough, and with enough authority. Not completely, not always, but enough that it had shaped the edges of everything she reached for, making her pull back just before the full reach, making her qualify her hopes before she said them aloud. The bread did not care about any of that. The bread was only interested in what she brought to it: time, attention, patience, willingness to fail and try again. The bread had no opinion about the size of her body, or the ambition of her plans. It only asked whether she was serious, and the answer she had given it, morning by morning for 11 weeks, was yes. She cut the loaf. The crumb inside was open and irregular, just as it should be, and it smelled like the earth and something slightly sweet, and something ancient. She handed Daniel a piece. He ate it and said nothing for a long moment. "Marin," he said. "I know," she said. She was already thinking about the next one. A woman named Gail Pruitt ran the neighborhood Facebook group with the energy of a person who had always wanted to run something, and had found, in the administration of a neighborhood social media page, her highest calling. She posted lost dog notices and road closure updates, and occasionally, without apparent awareness that it was strange, photographs of sunsets with inspirational quotes written over them in a decorative font. In mid-November, someone posted a photograph of Marin's market table. It was not a flattering photograph. It had been taken from across the aisle at an angle that made the display look smaller and less organized than it was, and Marin herself appeared at the edge of the frame, her back partially turned, wearing her flour-dusted apron. The caption read, "Is this really what we're calling artisan bread now?" By 9 the following morning, there were 43 comments. Marin read them in the parking lot of the insurance office before she went in. She sat in her car with the phone in her lap and read each one. She was methodical about it. She did not skim. She did not stop at the ones that were kind, or skip to the end hoping it improved. She read them in order, the way you read a document you need to fully understand before you respond to it. Most of the comments were not kind. They arranged themselves around a theme, which was that a woman who looked the way Marin looked had a particular kind of nerve, setting up a food table, and calling it artisan anything. Several commenters made jokes that were technically about bread but were actually about her body, in the way that cruel people often use the nearest available subject as a vehicle for the thing they actually mean. A few were worse than that. 2 were kind. A woman named Penny wrote that she had bought a loaf 2 weeks earlier, and it was the best bread she had ever eaten in Durango. Another person wrote simply, "Leave her alone." These comments had 6 collective reactions between them. Marin sat with the phone for a long time. She had been here before, not this exact place, not this exact group of strangers with this exact photograph, but she had been in the condition of reading what people thought of her body in a public space and deciding what to do with the information. She had been in this condition many times, across many years, and she had handled it in different ways at different times, some of which she was proud of, and some of which she was not. What she did not do was go inside and start her workday. Not yet. She stayed in the car. She opened a response field. She typed something. It was a good response, precise and measured. The kind of response that demonstrates clearly that the person writing it is more intelligent than the people it is addressed to. She read it back. She deleted it. She typed another one. Shorter. More direct. She read it back. She deleted that too. She sat with the blank field for a while. The thing about responding to that kind of comment in that kind of forum was that responding meant engaging, and engaging meant giving the conversation a life it did not deserve. It meant letting 43 strangers know that they had reached her, which was the only thing they had wanted to accomplish, and which she was not willing to give them. She closed the comment thread. She opened her photos instead. She had taken a photograph that morning, before she left the house. The loaf she had made the night before and refrigerated for a long, slow proof, baked fresh at 4:30 while the town was still dark. It was sitting on top of the cracked Dutch oven on the kitchen counter. The window light was coming in at an angle, that particular early morning Colorado light that is almost blue and almost gold at the same time, and commits fully to neither. The loaf was dark and blistered and perfect, and the Dutch oven beneath it was worn and cracked and also perfect in its own way. She had taken the photograph because it was beautiful. She had not planned to do anything with it. She posted it now. No caption, no explanation, no response, no engagement with the conversation that had been started about her. Just the bread on the Dutch oven in that window light, doing what it did. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. She went to work. She did not check the post for 4 hours. When she did, during her lunch break, eating a sandwich at her desk, she found that Penny had liked it, and so had the person who had written "Leave her alone," and so had 14 other people she did not recognize. She put the phone away again and finished her sandwich. By the end of the workday, 60 people had liked the photograph. A woman in Denver named Claire Hammond, who wrote a food column for a regional magazine, had shared it with a note that read, "Whoever is making this bread in Durango, I need to know." A chef based in Santa Fe named Owen Farrell, who had been nominated for a National Culinary Award the previous year, had shared it from Claire's page with no comment at all, which, if you understood how Owen Farrell used social media, meant more than any caption would have. The share that changed things came at 7:40 in the evening. Marin was in the kitchen starting the next batch when Daniel appeared in the doorway with his phone and a look on his face she had never seen before. A bread maker in Lyon, France. A man who had been baking for 40 years, and whose name was known in the serious corners of the baking world, the way certain names are known when the work is so quietly excellent, it eventually becomes impossible to ignore, had shared the photograph. He had written 2 words in French beneath it. Beautiful crust. That was all. Marin's phone was on the counter, face down, buzzing at intervals. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. She turned back to the dough. "I'll look at it later," she said. She scored the loaf she was working on, a long, clean diagonal cut that opened the surface exactly as it should. She slid it into the oven. She set the timer. The phone continued to buzz. She did not pick it up until the loaf was in, and the kitchen had returned to its correct quiet, and then she sat at the table and looked at what had happened while she was working. The photograph had been shared 312 times. There were messages from people she had never heard of asking about shipping, asking about her process, asking if she did custom orders, asking where she had trained. She had not trained anywhere. She had trained in the kitchen, with the cracked Dutch oven and the legal pad, and the 4:30 mornings and the loaves she had eaten alone because they were not good enough for anyone else yet. She did not know how to answer the messages that night, so she did not. She put the phone down and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about the difference between the photograph going somewhere and her going somewhere, which were not the same thing, and which she needed to keep separate in her mind if she was going to think about any of this clearly. The bread had gone somewhere. She was still here, in the house, with the dough proving in the refrigerator, and the workday tomorrow, and the market on Saturday, and everything exactly as it had been this morning, before she read those 43 comments in the parking lot. She was still here. She fell asleep before Daniel, which almost never happened, and she slept deeply, and in the morning she got up at 4 and went to the kitchen and began. The building had been empty for 2 years. It had been an auto parts store before that, and before that a small appliance repair shop, and before that something that no one in town could remember precisely, which meant it had been there long enough to become part of the background, the kind of building people stop seeing because it has always been there. It was on the main street through town, which was a real main street. the kind with a hardware store and a diner, and a post office that had been there since before most people alive could remember. It had large front windows that had been papered over from the inside, and a back room that was larger than the front, and a loading area accessed from the alley behind, and it smelled, when Marin first walked through it, like oil and dust, and the particular neutral smell of a space that has been waiting, without knowing what it is waiting for. She signed the lease on a Wednesday morning in February. Her right hand had a small burn on the knuckle from the oven that morning, and she signed with her left, which meant the signature looked nothing like her usual one, but the landlord did not comment on this. He watched her sign with the expression of a man who had rented this space to 3 previous tenants who had not lasted, and who was reserving judgment about the 4th. Marin did not offer to reassure him. She handed back the pen and shook his hand and walked back out into the February cold. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the papered windows and looked at the building. She had left the insurance job 6 weeks earlier. The leaving had been quieter than she expected. She had given proper notice, finished her final 2 weeks without making it into anything, and driven out of the parking lot on her last day without looking in the rearview mirror. The money situation was tight in the way that meant carefully planned, not the way that meant reckless. Daniel had run the numbers with her 3 times before she gave notice, because that was how he operated, and each time the numbers had said the same thing: it was possible, not comfortable but possible, if she was serious. She was serious. She had always been serious. Seriousness was possibly the thing she had most in excess, and she had found, over the past year, that bread was the one place where having too much of something was not a problem. She had the sign made by a woman who ran a small print and design shop on the edge of town. Marin told her what she wanted: the name Solis, plain letters, large enough to be readable from the far end of the block. No tagline, no subtitle, just the name. Caroline, who had heard about the bakery opening from Daniel, called the evening before the sign was installed to offer a suggestion. She said it in the same careful tone she used for all her suggestions, which was the tone of someone who believes they are being helpful and cannot understand why the recipient does not agree. She suggested a name that did not include Solis, something more accessible, she said. Something that would not make people have to think about whether they were pronouncing it correctly. Something, she said gently, that felt a little more local. Marin listened to this with the phone pressed to her ear, and her eyes on the legal pad in front of her, where she had been working through the next week's production schedule. "The sign is already ordered," Marin said, which was not exactly true yet, but became true the next morning when she called the sign maker and asked her to go up 1 full size from what they had discussed. The sign went up on a Thursday. It was larger than the other signs on the block. Solis, in clean dark letters, visible from the far end of the street on a clear day. Marin stood across the road and looked at it for several minutes. A man she did not know walked past and nodded at the building. "Opening soon?" he said. 2 weeks, she said. "What kind of place?" "Bread," she said. He nodded again, the nod of a man who had not expected that answer, and was not against it, and he kept walking. She went around to the back door and into the kitchen and started work. The kitchen she had built inside that auto parts store was serious in the way she was serious. A proofing cabinet. A deck oven she had purchased secondhand from a restaurant in Albuquerque that had closed, which she and Daniel had rented a van to transport, which had required 4 people and 2 hours to move into the space. Long stainless steel work tables. Shelving for the flour, organized by grain type, in the order she used them. The cracked Dutch oven was on the shelf above the work table closest to the oven, not because she still needed it for production, but because it was the thing she had used to learn, and she was not going to put it in a box somewhere. She opened on the first Saturday in March. She had told no one except Daniel and Penny, and the woman who had written "Leave Her Alone," who turned out to be a retired schoolteacher named Gloria Marsh, who lived 4 blocks from the bakery, and came in at 8:15 on opening day, with a thermos of coffee, and stood in line with everyone else. There was a line. Marin had not fully anticipated a line, even after everything that had happened online, because she had spent 31 years learning not to assume that good things would scale up to match her hopes. But there it was, 14 people before she unlocked the door, and more arriving by the time she had been open for 20 minutes. She had baked 30 loaves for opening day. They were gone by 10:40. She turned the sign to closed and stood in the empty shop and looked at the empty shelves, and the quiet was so sudden after the morning that it felt like a different kind of sound. She went into the kitchen. She put on a fresh apron. She began the next batch. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her working life. She was getting up at 2:30 to be in the kitchen by 3. She was baking through the morning, selling through the late morning and early afternoon, and then spending the remaining hours of the day on ordering, scheduling, and the particular kind of problem-solving that comes with running a kitchen alone in a building that had been an auto parts store and had the plumbing to prove it. She ate lunch standing up. She ate dinner at 8 or 9, whatever Daniel had managed, and she was in bed by 9:30, and her body worked so hard, and so truly by then, that sleep came before the thought of trying. She did not complain about this. She had chosen it, and she knew she had chosen it, and she was not going to perform fatigue at a life she had decided on. But she also did not pretend it was easy, because it was not easy, and pretending things that are not easy are easy is how people end up resenting the things they love. Claire Hammond drove down from Denver and wrote a piece for the regional magazine. It ran with a photograph of Maren at the work table, hands in dough, looking directly at the camera without any particular expression, just the steady look of a person who is in the right place. The piece was shared widely. Letters came in. A woman wrote from Montana to say she had cried reading it, which Maren found slightly alarming, because she had not put anything in the bread that should make people cry. And then she realized the woman was crying about something else, about the thing underneath the bread, which was the story of a person who was told no and continued anyway. Claire's piece was followed, some months later, by a writer from the New York Times food section named Arthur Greer, who drove from the airport in Albuquerque and arrived at Solis Bread on a Tuesday, and stood in line with everyone else and ordered a loaf of the Sonoran White and sat at the small table near the window and ate nearly all of it before he opened his notebook. He wrote down his first question, looked up, and said, "Where did you train?" Maren looked at him across the counter. "Here," she said. He wrote something down. "And before here?" "My kitchen," she said. 412 batches before I felt like I knew what I was doing. He wrote that down too. She could tell by the way he wrote it that it was going to be in the piece, and she did not mind. Caroline came in on a Thursday afternoon in late April. She did not call ahead. She came in and stood at the counter and looked at the loaves on the shelf behind Maren, and looked at the sign on the wall, and looked at the line that was still there, even at 2 in the afternoon, even on a Thursday, even after 5 weeks of being open. She ordered a loaf of the red fife. She paid for it without being asked about a discount, or mentioning that she was the mother-in-law, both of which Maren had, on some level, been braced for. Maren took the loaf from the shelf. She wrapped it in the unprinted brown paper she used, which she had chosen deliberately because she did not want anything between the bread and the person holding it, except the thinnest necessary layer. She tied it with white string and set it on the counter. Caroline picked it up. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it the way people do when they are not sure what they are holding. She did not say she had been wrong about the bakery. She did not say she had been wrong about any of it. She looked at the loaf in her hands, and she looked at Maren, and she said thank you, in the tone of a woman who means something slightly larger than what she is saying. Maren nodded. Caroline left. Maren turned back to the kitchen. There were 3 loaves coming out in 12 minutes, and she needed to be there when they did. She found out about the James Beard nomination on a Wednesday morning at 6:14, while she was scoring a Miche. The email had been sent the night before. She had not seen it, because she had been in bed by 9:30, and she did not check her phone until she was already in the kitchen, already in the apron, already an hour into the morning's work. She was holding the lame, which is the small blade used to score bread, and she was drawing a long diagonal line across the surface of the miche, and the line was going correctly, opening just enough to let the loaf expand without tearing, which was a thing that had taken her many months to learn to do with consistency. Her phone was on the shelf near the door. She heard it buzz. She finished the score. She placed the miche in the oven and closed the door. Then she picked up the phone. She read the email. She put the phone back on the shelf. She reset the timer for the miche and began preparing the next loaf. She did not stop working. Not then. Not later when Daniel called. having seen the same email on the bakery account they both had access to, and she heard in his voice the contained joy of a person trying not to make too large a thing of something enormous. She finished the morning's baking before she let herself sit down, and even then she sat at the work table with a cup of coffee and the morning's production list, and she went through what still needed to be done that day, which was the same things that had needed to be done every day for the past several years, and which did not change because of an email. The nomination was for Outstanding Baker. The category recognized not only the quality of the work, but what the work had contributed to its community, and to the wider understanding of what bread could be. The people who made these decisions had sent someone to Durango the previous autumn, a quiet woman named Helen who had eaten 3 different loaves, and asked questions that Marin had recognized, even at the time, as questions from someone who was forming an assessment rather than just curious. The community had changed around Solis Bread in ways Marin had not fully predicted. She had expected the bakery to become a place people came to buy bread, which was what she had planned for and what she had built. She had not expected it to become a place, in the way that certain places become places, which is to say a location with a gravitational force, where the bread is the official reason, and the real reason is something harder to name. Gloria Marsh, the retired school teacher who had come on opening day with her thermos, came in every Tuesday. She never said much. She bought a loaf of whichever grain was in that week, and sometimes she bought a second, and once, during a cold December, she had brought in a card that she handed to Marin, and walked out without waiting for it to be opened. Inside was a sentence that Marin had folded up and put in the pocket of her work apron, and that had since gone through the wash 3 times and was no longer readable, but which she kept anyway, because she remembered what it said. It said, "You gave this town something to be proud of, and I think you should know that." Ranching families began coming from a distance. They were not people who talked about food the way the food writers talked about it, and they did not use words like heritage grain or fermentation profile or open crumb. They came because someone had told them the bread was good, and good bread was a simple and serious thing to them, and when they tasted it they came back, which was the oldest and most honest form of review. The second location came later, in Taos, and it came because a woman named Louise Whitaker, who had been running a small restaurant there for 8 years, had been driving to Durango twice a month to buy bread from Solis, and had eventually sat down with Marin, and said that the driving was making her feel unreasonable, and that she would like to propose an arrangement. The arrangement became a second location. Louise ran the front, Marin's system ran the kitchen. The bread was the same bread. The apprentices came because Marin decided they should, not because she had planned to expand in that direction, but because 2 things had happened in the same week, and she had recognized them as related. The first was a woman named Dana Cole who applied for a job via email and listed her experience as, "I have been baking bread for 2 years, and I think I might be serious about it, but I'm not sure yet." The second was a conversation with Arthur Greer's piece in the Times, which she had read several more times than she would admit, and specifically the line he had written about how Solis Bread felt like the work of someone who had learned the hardest possible way, which was the only way to learn anything that lasts. She hired Dana. She trained her the same way she herself had learned, which was by doing it, badly at first and then less badly, with someone next to her who had already made the mistakes and could tell her which ones mattered and which ones were just the education. Dana was followed by a woman named Ruth, who was 23 and furiously talented, and had a habit of pushing the fermentation past where Marin had told her to take it, which produced results that were sometimes wrong and occasionally startling, and once produced a loaf that Marin ate half of while standing at the work table, and then stood looking at the other half for a moment before she said, "Do that again, and write down exactly what you did." The third apprentice was a girl who came in on a Tuesday morning before the line formed, before the open sign was turned, when the light outside was still low, and the town around the bakery had not yet committed to the day. She was 16. She was heavy-set in the way that Marin recognized with a precision she would not have been able to describe to anyone, which was the way of a girl who had learned to move through public space with a specific kind of careful, a way of taking up exactly as little room as possible, without making it obvious that the calculation was happening. She knocked on the glass door. Marin, who was already at the work table with her hands in dough, looked up. She went to the door and opened it. The girl said that she wanted to learn to bake bread. She said she had been reading about it. She said she didn't have any experience and she understood if that was a problem. Marin looked at her for a moment. She reached past her to the shelf near the door and took down a bench scraper, which is a flat metal tool used to divide and move dough, and she held it out. The girl took it. "Come in," Marin said. That was the interview. She taught the girl, whose name was Claire, the same way she taught all of them, which was the same way she had taught herself, by starting with the basics and refusing to rush them, and expecting failure, and making it clear that failure was the tuition. She taught her to feel when the dough was right, which was something you could not teach with words and could only teach with repetition and patience and the willingness to stay in the room long after the exciting part was over. The girl was a quick learner, not showy, not the kind of quick that announces itself, but the kind that accumulates quietly, and then one morning is simply there, visible in the certainty of the movements, the confidence of the hands. 4 months after she started, she scored a miche in a single clean motion that Marin watched from across the kitchen and said nothing about, because some things do not need to be said to be received. The award ceremony, when it came, was in Chicago. Daniel flew with her. She wore a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, not ivory satin, not something that needed to be let out at the shoulders, but a dark blue dress that she had chosen because she liked how she looked in it, which was a sentence she had not been able to say easily for most of her life, and which she practiced saying to herself now, because she believed, at 34, that practicing it was worth the effort. She did not win. She was a finalist. She sat at the table in the large hotel ballroom and listened to the name of the winner and clapped with genuine feeling, and then had a conversation with a pastry chef from New Orleans who knew Owen Farrell and who had tasted Marin's bread at a food event in Denver the previous spring, and who said, with the directness of people who work in kitchens, that the Sonoran White was one of the best loaves she had tasted in the country. Marin said thank you, and meant it, and did not diminish it by adding anything. On the plane home, she leaned against the window and looked at the clouds below them and thought about the question every journalist eventually asked her, which was what it had felt like when they mocked her. She had given the same answer many times by then. She was not sure she had been mocked exactly. She thought she had been visible, and that some people were not ready for a woman who looked like her to be visible in that particular way, standing behind a table with bread she had made, and a name on a sign, and no apology anywhere in her posture. She gave that answer, and she meant it, and it was also not the whole answer, because the whole answer included the parking lot, and the 43 comments, and the hour she had sat with her hands in her lap, deciding not to give those people what they wanted, which was her diminishment. The whole answer included the dress fitting, and Caroline's voice, and 14 years of rooms where she had been too much of something. She did not give the whole answer in interviews, because the whole answer was hers, and she was under no obligation to portion it out for other people's consumption. The plane descended. Denver spread out below in its grid of lights, and beyond it, at the edge of the dark, the first suggestions of the mountains. She was going home to the kitchen, to the cracked Dutch oven on the shelf, and the 4:30 alarm, and the smell of the Sonoran White going into the oven, and coming out 28 minutes later, dark and blistered and ringing hollow when you knocked the bottom, which was the sound she had been chasing since the first failed loaf on the counter of a rental kitchen in the second week of a marriage. That was also the first week of something else entirely. She had never been trying to change anything. She had been trying to make something true. The West had changed anyway. Slowly, the way real things change, without announcement. Chefs in 4 states were using her flour contacts. 2 heritage grain farms had expanded their operations partly on the strength of orders from Solis Bread and the people she had pointed toward them. A young woman in a town 40 miles south of Durango had started a sourdough table at her own farmer's market, and when a journalist asked her what had inspired her, she said a bakery she had visited once, and the way the woman behind the counter had looked at her, which was like she saw her fully and expected good things from her. Marin read that in an email forward from Gloria Marsh and sat with it for a long time. In the morning, she was in the kitchen at 3:40. The radio was low. The ovens were warming. Ruth was already there, working on her levain, and Claire was behind her measuring grain, and there was flour in the air the way there was always flour in the air. hanging in the early morning light like something that had always been there and always would be. Maren put on her apron. She tied it. She felt the old weight of the flour dusted into the fabric, and the small, stiff place where it had dried from yesterday, and the slight difference in the texture on the left side from where she always wiped her hands. She went to the work table. The dough from last night's cold proof was waiting. She turned it out onto the floured surface. It came out clean and cold and full of the slow work of the overnight fermentation, which was invisible work, the kind that happened without you watching, the kind you had to trust. She began. The sound of dough being worked, the low radio, Ruth asking Claire a question about hydration, and Claire answering it with more certainty than she had 4 months ago, which was a small and unremarkable thing that was also the whole point of everything. Outside, the town was still dark, and still, and completely unaware that anything particular was happening in the kitchen behind the large windows with the sign above them. The mountains to the east were black against a sky that was just beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change. Maren's hands moved through the dough. Flour settled on her knuckles and into the creases of her palms, the way it always did, the way it had from the first batch in the midnight kitchen with the 4 bags from the grocery store, and the dream she had not yet learned to say out loud without qualifying it. She did not wash it off between batches anymore. She had stopped doing that somewhere in the 2nd year. The flour stayed, layer over layer, fine and white, and permanent, in the way that things become permanent when you do them enough times with enough intention. It was the record of every loaf, every 4:30 morning, every failure eaten standing at the counter, every person who had said, in one way or another, that this was not for her. Proof that she had always known how to take heat. The first loaves went in. The oven door closed. The kitchen filled with the sound of bread beginning to do what bread does when everything has been done correctly, which is to rise, quietly and without drama, into exactly what it was always going to be.